All right, so the Inca civilization are going to come to control a large area in South America stretching along the Andes Mountains. And they're going to settle in this region and conquer the earlier civilizations that were there. This included groups like the Chamu people. They were a wealthy civilization in modern day Peru, and there were many other kind of herders and farmers that they gradually conquered and brought that region under their control. And one of their early leaders, Pachacuti, he's going to rule the Inca from 1438 to 1471. He's going to really begin this rapid expansion of the Inca. And first off, the Inca are not what they called themselves. The Inca was a term for their leader, but we refer to him as the Inca Empire. And so Pachacuti, both through military conquest and alliances, is going to bring most of the region, eventually stretching all the way from modern day Colombia to Chile, under the Inca control. And basically, for the next 60 years, the Inca were in this state of constant expansion and constantly on the move. And so when we look at the Inca administration, first off, it's very different from the Aztecs. The Aztecs created a tribute empire and basically conquered peoples and left them alone as long as they paid tribute to the Aztecs. The Inca, first off, were much more centralized. Pretty much all of the land was considered under the control of the state. And the state kind of assigned land to others. And they create this huge bureaucracy. And most of the noble class served in the bureaucracy in some form or fashion. They ruled from their capital at Cuzco. The Inca, you can look at them as being a theocratic government because the Inca, the ruler, was seen as almost a god himself, definitely divine. And so the Inca, the ruler, ruled from Cuzco, and then they divided their empire into provinces. And so it started with 4 main provinces, and then from there it was subdivided further. But they appointed local rulers from this nobility class, and these nobles didn't have to pay tribute. They were given land. They could use people in their territory for labor. And to ensure that they kind of stayed loyal to the Inca, their sons were taken to the capital, basically held hostage. But their sons were also well educated in the process as well. And so the Inca create this large bureaucracy, and they continued to expand. And one of the reasons for this continuous expansion was the idea of split inheritance. And so when a new ruler took over, political power went to the new successor, but the wealth and the land of the previous ruler stayed with that previous ruler's family, specifically his male descendants. And so every new Inca ruler had to secure new wealth and land for himself. And so that's one of the reasons why the Inca state was constantly expanding. When we look at the Inca bureaucracy, highly centralized, under the control of the Inca state. They even controlled the economy. And so they kind of appointed economic zones. And the idea was that each of their provinces, each of those 4 main provinces, would be self-sufficient. But the Inca even controlled trade, and we'll look more at that here in a little bit as well. When we look at the Inca, they did not have a true writing system. They had instead a record-keeping system called the quipu, and you can see an image of it here on the right. The quipu was basically a system of knots that was used for recording numerical data. And so it worked similar to an abacus, and they could use it to kind of track financial records and things like that. But they did not have a true written record. All right, Inca society, first off, no merchant class. It's a key difference that we see between the Inca and the Aztecs. They didn't need a merchant class. Most of the trade, most of the economy was controlled by the state, and so they simply had no need for an elaborate merchant class. Peasants. Peasants made up, just like in the Aztec Empire, a bulk of the population. And peasants had to take turns working for the state. It's a system called the Mita system. And under the Mita, these communities, the peasants in each of these communities took turns working on state land. And so that could include things like agriculture, but it also included public works, public buildings, working for the church, things like that. One of these large-scale public works that the Inca were known for was their road system. They had an elaborate road system that stretched throughout the empire, over 2,500 miles of Inca roads. And along these roads, they had these tombos, these stations. So about every day's walk, they had a station set up. And the road helped kind of integrate the Inca Empire. And it also allowed them to move their military quickly when needed as well. When we look at the Inca religion, it shares some similarities, but also some differences to the Aztecs. First off, Inca religion was polytheistic. They had many different gods, just like the Aztecs. The sun god was considered the highest deity. They even had a temple of the sun in Cuzco that held the remains of past Inca rulers. And so the sun god was the most important, but again, many different deities. They had holy shrines throughout the empire, religious centers similar to the Aztecs where prayers and sacrifices took place. And much like the Aztecs, they too practiced sacrifice. They sacrificed animals, they sacrificed goods, but they also sacrificed humans. Just like the Aztecs, they too had a priest class, and the priests, just like in the Aztec Empire, they were responsible for organizing these ceremonies and rituals and interpreting the gods as well. A key difference, so when we look at the Inca religion, ancestors played a much bigger role in the Inca religion. Ancestors were very important. Past rulers were mummified and basically treated as kind of an intermediary to the gods. And they continued to pay tribute to past ancestors. Last thing we're going to look at here is the isolation of the Americas and the impact that that's going to have on them, especially in the next era with the arrival of the Europeans. And so, first off, the isolation of the Americas, meaning their isolation from Afro-Eurasia, kept them from a lot of key technologies. And so some of these technologies were extremely simple. They never develop a wheel. And the reason they don't develop a wheel is basically because there weren't any large domesticated animals that they could use to pull carts and things like that. And so that set them back. They never develop a plow for similar reasons. Again, if you don't have large domesticated animals to pull a plow, you have no use for it. Not just iron, but metallurgy in general, but especially iron. And so this kept them from key iron weapons, but also iron tools as well. And then one of the kind of biggest limitations was that because they were cut off from Afro-Eurasia, they never developed any kind of natural immunity to various Afro-Eurasian diseases. And we're going to see this in the next era. When the Europeans arrive, the most devastating aspect of the arrival of the Europeans was the spread of their diseases.